All right. Welcome, everyone, to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium for the 5th of November. Thanks very much again for joining us today. We begin the University Interdisciplinary Colloquia with the Michigan State University Land Acknowledgement. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on the land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. If you're interested in learning more about land acknowledgements or the MSU land acknowledgement in particular, I'll put a couple of links in the chat after I've introduced our speakers today. The University Interdisciplinary Colloquium is a forum organized by the Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinarity and sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters that highlights the innovative and important interdisciplinary work involving arts and the humanities at Michigan State. Interdisciplinarity at major research universities like MSU is often a cover term for well-funded complex science. So the emphasis often when interdisciplinarity is discussed at places like this is STEM. But what gets lost is the fact that, at least from my perspective, the fact that some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work reflects an appreciation for the aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of human experience broadly construed. It's artists and humanists out there doing really interesting and important interdisciplinary work who maybe don't get the kind of attention that they deserve based on the quality of the work they're producing. And the UIC, or the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, is an attempt to acknowledge and amplify interdisciplinary contributions that feature aesthetic and humanistic elements. We meet every other week, more or less. This week we're meeting 1 week after we met last time. So, but for the most part, we meet every other week during the fall and the spring semesters. And this year, all of our University Interdisciplinary Colloquia will be on Zoom. So the link you use today to access this meeting will work to access the other meetings that will be sponsoring this semester and next semester. A word about the question and answer plan. Today we have with us Dr. Laura Yaerus and Betsy Sneller. While they're delivering their presentation, if you have a question, please deposit it in the Zoom chat or use the webinar Q&A function. So, as these questions or comments come to you, please feel free to put them in one of those two locations. After they have finished their remarks, I will read the questions and comments out for response in the order that we receive them. The next University Interdisciplinary Colloquium will be Friday, November 19th, so in 2 weeks, from 12 to 1 on Zoom. Again, using the same Zoom link will get you here. Our speaker will be Dr. Stephen DiBenedetto, a professor and chairperson of the Department of Theater, who will give a talk entitled, "Who Owns a Cultural Heritage Site? Experiments with Digital Technologies and Immersive Performance as Preservation." So that's in 2 weeks. Today, though, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Betsy Sneller and Dr. Laura Yaerus. Dr. Betsy Sneller is an assistant professor of sociolinguistics in the Department of Linguistics, Languages, and Cultures at Michigan State. Her research analyzes how social factors impact language change in real time from one generation to the next. Her work has been published in a number of top-tier journals in linguistics, including Language Variation and Change and Cognition. She recently received an NSF grant to support her latest project, Michigan Diaries, which is a large interdisciplinary project documenting changes to the lives and languages of Michiganders during the pandemic and beyond. Dr. Laura Yaerus is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies and a core faculty member in the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies. Her research and teaching focuses on Judaism in the United States, with particular interest in Jewish education. Her interdisciplinary graduate training in religious studies includes included historical research methodologies, as well as contemporary ethnographic fieldwork. She is currently at work on a book about American Jewish Sunday schools in the 19th century and a book on Jewish learning and cultural arts in the contemporary era. Today, Dr. Sneller and Dr. Yares are with us to deliver a talk entitled The Interdisciplinary Water Cooler, Sharing Research Technologies Across Disciplines. Doctors.
Thank you, Michael, for such a great introduction. So this talk is going to be broken up into sort of two distinct talks. I'll give an overview of the Michigan Diaries project, and then Dr. Yares will talk about how interdisciplinary benefits come from the interdisciplinary water cooler. And I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Let me just try one more time so that you can get the slides and not the notes. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. That's great.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the Michigan Diaries project started in April of 2020, right after the COVID pandemic was declared a pandemic. So I'm a sociolinguist. I study language change. And one of the basic factors of language change is that most language change is normally driven primarily by face-to-face interaction. So this means that the lockdowns threatened to cause a potentially massive disruption to this critical mechanism of language change. So as sociolinguists, we recognized, and we being myself and my co-PI, Dr. Wagner, also in the Department of Linguistics, Languages, and Cultures, presented an unusual opportunity to observe the linguistic effects of sudden social isolation. And at the same time, we also recognized that people in Michigan and also across the country were thrown into this unprecedented social landscape where their lives were changing daily. And we wanted to provide a way for people to document how their lives and language were changing in real time. So we turned to audio self-recordings, so audio diaries, as a safe and remote method of collecting spontaneous speech rapidly from people across the state. So we're doing linguistic data collection, but we have to make it remote. And this is quite a big challenge because sociolinguistic fieldwork typically involves the long-term immersion of the researcher into the speech community. And so we had this big challenge to approximate the critical components of face-to-face ethnographic research, but do it remotely. So practically, we had to make sure that we had sufficient acoustic quality so that we could analyze this data down the road. But we also needed participants to be able to trust us enough to speak spontaneously in a casual style, despite it being impossible for us to build the sort of face-to-face rapport with them. We also needed parents of young children to be able to trust us enough to sign up their children for the project. So we started out by having participants record on whatever devices they had at hand, their mobile devices or their computer, and dropping off their audio files on our first iteration of our website, which I primarily put here as a way to show you how our project started with very rough and tumble components that ended up getting improved by the interdisciplinary team. So this is our ugly first website. This turned out to not be this worked, but it turned out to be not a long-term solution because of a number of factors, including that this drag and drop audio file situation came from my Box account from my previous institution, and Michigan State's restrictions don't allow anyone to just drag and drop a file. So we had to find another solution. So we turned to audio diaries via a mobile app. And this, I'm like glossing over the huge amount of interdisciplinary work that went into actually creating. It's quite a simple app, but it took quite a bit of work. So I'm just giving a shout out here to the student programmer who programmed the front end of the things, and Russ Werner, who's now a tech in engineering, who programmed the back end of things. Absolute rock stars. The benefit here is that these native iOS and Android apps work with smartphones, which in the year 2020 and beyond are good enough. They have high quality acoustic data that roughly approximates the like high-end linguistic acoustic microphones that we use. But it ended up having a number of other benefits. Like diarists could participate from a really wide geographic area. We didn't have to be in person to interview them. They could participate on their own schedule. And in the future, having an app means that we can potentially incorporate a little bit of gamification to help encourage diarists to keep participating. When diarists submit their entries, they come into this back-end server. This was built by Russ on, so this is all Michigan State hosted. You can see here that as files come in, we can easily see who they are, what their age group is, and then we can click in and view the individual entries. And the individual entries here are transcribed. They're run through first pass automatic speech recognition, and then they're hand fixed by research assistants. Having it run through ASR in the first place is part of the reason this project is able to work. The human corrections is 5 times faster than having a human actually transcribe in real time. And more importantly, our research team can see at a glance what people are talking about each week, which then informs the next week of our project. So the whole purpose of our project is to understand how people really talk, because we're trying to understand language change as it actually is used in everyday life. So we need participants, again, to feel motivated to speak informally and to feel like they can trust us enough to share their everyday and private thoughts. So we think that having this official app with MSU branding helps with this, but so does our revamped project website, which is, here's our current website. You can see it's much nicer. So our website is a way for participants to learn about the project. You can see our little welcome blurb, learn about the project here, but also for a way for participants to engage with the project. So you can see down here the beginning of some snippets. Each week, our team of researchers selects between 1 to 6 anonymized little short snippets that we've heard from that past week from diarists who consent to having their audio shared on the website to feature on our website. So this allows new diarists to listen through, start feeling connected to each other, and gain a sense of what participating in the project is going to be like. While diarists are always anonymous on our site, we've also created a non-anonymous get to know the team page where we have pictures of ourselves and personal snippets from our own lives too, so that diarists don't feel like it's just going one way, that they feel like the team is also in it with them. So you can see here myself and my co-PI, Dr. Wagner. And if you were to scroll down, you would see our very large interdisciplinary team of students. Okay, and then the last thing is that diarists also can see these diary archives. So every week we're selecting a handful of snippets to feature, and those end up going on our archive so that you can scroll down and see every single week dating back to April of 2020, what were we hearing? What were Michiganders talking about? And this is just a quick little shout out to a redesign that's in process. A student design team is in the process of revamping our website again to make it hosted on Michigan State domains. And I think it's beautiful. Okay, so we want to get, again, casual speech data. How do people really talk? So we've got the app, we've got our website, but we also have this need to get people talking to us like they're talking to a friend. So part of our job is to give them topics to talk about. So we send out a diary email every week that has updates from the team. So you can see here, we're in the middle of a set of regional themes where our questions are about regions in the US. We always send out the selected stories from the previous week so that they can easily click and see what people were saying last week. And then importantly, new diary prompts, which we create every single week new, so that participating in the project is fresh and fun. So you can see here the diary prompts that we sent out last week to our teen participants, loosely based on New England. This one here, a city in Maine made a Christmas tree entirely out of lobster traps. What would a Michigan Christmas tree be made out of? Generated a lot of really interesting responses. Okay, so our corpus so far, we think it's working. We have, over the past year and a half, We've received almost 2,000 diary entries from over 250 diarists. Most of these diarists, or slightly more than half, are repeat diarists who continue regularly to submit diary entries. This is over 375 hours of audio diary. And importantly for us, we've received diary stories that cover a range of experiences, topics, and emotions, which shows us that at least some diarists do feel safe sharing even very personal and difficult experience with us. So, excuse me, we've received stories where diarists break down in tears in the middle of the story. We've received lots of stories of hope. We've received lots of stories of everyday things, like just the mundane experiences of everyday life, which is data gold for us. And also linguistic questions. Sometimes we ask linguistic questions like, what do you think the difference is between sneakers and tennis shoes? So I'm going to play a little clip here of, this is a child diarist who gave us a little bit of hope in her diary entry. And let me know if you can't hear this.
I think that one of the things that I was thinking about that kind of relates to being at home is that if you think about some Disney princesses like Rapunzel and Elsa and Anna, I really like those Disney princesses, and those Disney princesses had to stay home, for example, because they had to stay home, and Rapunzel was locked in a room for a while. But if there's a song in the movie Tangled, which is "When Will My Life Begin?" and it says all the things she did that day. I think that's a really big inspiration, because if you think about it, there's a lot of things that you can do even at home, and if she could get by, I bet we can too. And nonetheless, yes, it can be very boring, but I really think that that's a good inspirational song, even if it was made way before any of this happened. It kind of relates.
It kind of relates. We felt it related too. We got lots of different stories about what kids and teens in particular were doing to handle the boredom, to handle lockdowns, which I think is pretty interesting. So our corpus exists in sort of 3 stages. And when diarists sign up for the project, they let us know basically how private they want their data to be. So the full corpus, which is 20-minute long diary entries at a time, exist on our server on Michigan State's servers. But we also have this public archive of our selected stories that I alluded to that exists on our website. And soon we have a partnership with the Library of Michigan where we're planning to deposit anonymized full stories from diarists who have consented and send those over to the Library of Michigan so that this will become a publicly available archive for other folks to explore. The public data, the stuff that's on our website and eventually in the Library of Michigan, is licensed under Creative Commons non-commercial reuse with attribution. What this means is that folks can use this data. We actually heard yesterday at the Digital Humanities Locus quite a few really inspiring talks about ways that, for instance, a high school teacher is incorporating Michigan Diaries into her classroom curriculum and having participants, her high schoolers participate as part of the project. We heard about a TESOL PhD student who is using these diary snippets as examples of authentic speech, sort of, native authentic speech. Okay, so there's a lot of opportunities for future interdisciplinary connections as well. I just want to highlight a couple of things. We are, of course, there's also practical challenges with participant recruitment because we're fully virtual, although we're starting to get a little bit in person as well. You can see our nice poster that one of our design students made for us. And we've been trying to send this out to Facebook groups, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit turns out to be a very prolific participant recruitment venue, but also any newsletters that we can get into. So our partners at the Library of Michigan, our partners at 4-H, different school districts have sent out blurbs inviting people to participate. I forgot to mention this, participants are compensated $5 every 2 weeks points if they submit at least 15 minutes of audio diary. So there's also participant compensation. But yeah, we are open to other ideas for recruitment. We would like to make this corpus really representative of the state of Michigan. So this brings up a number of related problems. So we want, as like a corpus of pandemic experiences, we want to make sure that our actual corpus reflects the diversity of these experiences. And this is still kind of an issue. So our participant school pool skews primarily white, female, and millennial. So we're working on potential solutions. Most of these involve making personal connections with organizations serving people of color and folks of other ages, so schools and youth programs. This brings up a related problem, which is that teachers and youth workers in particular are already really overburdened. They've been overburdened since the beginning of the pandemic. And so we're working on making like very easy off-the-shelf ways to participate that don't require a lot of teacher input. But of course, successful partnerships and outreach takes a lot of time, which is something that I haven't figured out a solution for yet. So I've got a little smiley face there. If any of you here has any suggestions or recommendations, I would be very happy to hear them. So there's a lot more to say about the practical side of getting this project up and running that I'll leave that to the discussion part so that we can focus on the aspects here that are most relevant to interdisciplinarity, which is just to say the entire project relies absolutely on interdisciplinarity. So from getting the project up and running in the first place to improving aspects of the project. So you've seen a couple iterations of our website, which is getting iteratively better and better. And that is entirely because of our interdisciplinary student team and the support from staff and folks in other departments at Michigan State. We've got, so this is in part our like improved branding ideas here. Two of our students won a first place poster prize about our branding last year at URAF. We've got a student who helped us make our website more accessible visually. And then connections with community partners, which we are continually working on, is another important place for interdisciplinarity, but also in future analysis. So I'm a sociolinguist. I'm going to use this data to analyze how language is changing, but it is a corpus that has huge potential. So huge potential for historical primary sources, for sociology, for education. So I've got this little blurb here. If anybody here has an idea that they would like to collaborate with us on, please get in touch. We are very open to other interdisciplinary ideas. Okay, so this is a short overview of the Michigan Diaries project. I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Laura for the meat of this interdisciplinary talk.
All right, so I am going to just set up my slides here. Okay, hopefully you can now all see my first slide that says Shtisel Diaries. Can someone give me an indication? We've had a little bit of trouble with our tech today.
I can't see the slide, it's just white.
Okay, bear with me one. Any better? Great.
That works.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to take us now in a different direction entirely, which is to talk about how we adapted the Michigan Diaries app for a very different project altogether that serves very interdisciplinary ends. So this project is a project we're calling Shtisel Diaries. I'll explain that title later on. And it's part of a broader study on learning about religion and particularly about Judaism through the cultural arts. And we're interested in the various ways that people learn about religious traditions through participating in cultural activities like visiting museums, like watching movies and listening to music. Now, this is a project that is co-directed with a colleague of mine who is at CUNY, Dr. Sharon Avni. And we're an inherently interdisciplinary team as well. So Sharon is a sociolinguist and my training is in religious studies. But we're both interested in the intersections between religion and education and the ways in which people learn about religion in different settings and what religious learning really looks like. So our original idea for this project was for pretty conventional ethnographic fieldwork. We're both trained in ethnographic fieldwork methods, and we imagined that to conduct this project, we would be visiting museums and film festivals and art workshops. And COVID put a really obvious wrench in our plans. We simply couldn't go to these places, and our research essentially stopped. Then a few months into the pandemic, I attended a session organized by Sonia Fritchie and Bill Hart-Davidson in the College of Arts and Letters. And this was a supportive event for Cal faculty and graduate students to share the ideas and the challenges relating to conducting research in the wake of the pandemic. And at that meeting, Betsy and her colleague Suzanne presented their work developing the Michigan Diaries app. And it got me thinking how we might be able to use an app like this in our work. Because we had noticed that although people might not be going out to concerts or museums, during lockdown, they were watching a lot of television, and they were more willing to take risks on television shows that in different ways might have expanded their cultural palettes. And this goes some way to explaining the enormous interest in a show called Shtisel, which was a somewhat unlikely Netflix success story. It's about a family of Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jews living in Jerusalem in a neighborhood called Geula. Now, during COVID, a small but noticeable menu of shows about ultra-Orthodox Jews, that is, Jews who conform to a particularly strict interpretation of Jewish law, shows came to Netflix. Now, you may have seen Unorthodox, which was a drama series about a woman leaving her community in New York and building a new life in Germany. Or One of Us, which was a documentary series about people who had left their ultra-Orthodox communities of birth. Or maybe you've seen My Unorthodox Life, which is a reality TV series about formerly Orthodox folks. Well, Shtisel was sort of different within this menu because these stories are all in many ways classic Enlightenment narratives. They're stories about people sort of leaving behind the strictures of relatively close communities and embracing the possibilities and choices of modernity. Shtisel was quite different here. It doesn't center on storylines about characters leaving the fold. It focuses instead on the very day-to-day lives of a family of ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Shtisel family. It focuses on their quotidian struggles as they attempt to find love and raise children and pursue careers. It was produced in Israel, and it was filmed in a mixture of Yiddish, the lingua franca of most ultra-Orthodox Jews, and also in Hebrew, which is a primary spoken language in Israel. Viewers who were not familiar with Yiddish or Hebrew could watch the show with subtitles. Now, the first two series of Shtisel came to Netflix in 2018, but its popularity really surged during the COVID-19 lockdowns. And we were really interested in finding out more about what people from various backgrounds learned when they watched the show. So not long after learning about the Michigan Diaries app, we began hearing about a popular Facebook group that had been set up for fans of Shtisel. It was called Shtisel Let's Talk About It, and coincidentally was founded by 3 women from Detroit. Now, it's a really substantial and very active community. It currently has over 33,000 members. And members of the group come from across the United States, as well as from overseas. They include Jews of every imaginable denominational identity, as well as members who self-identify as practitioners of other religions, and members who identify as atheist and secular as well. Now, it quickly became apparent to us that this Facebook group might make for a very fruitful online ethnographic field site to investigate what different people from different backgrounds learned about ultra-Orthodox Jews when they watched Shtisel. And it also made for a natural population from which to recruit for participants in our diary app project. So we designed a mixed methods approach to our data collection. We began with our digital fieldwork. With a really deep dive into the Facebook group. We scraped and analyzed postings to Shtisel Let's Talk About It. We conducted a survey of members, and we also interviewed the group's founders and some of its more frequent contributors. And then Netflix announced that it was planning to bring the third and likely final series of Shtisel to US Netflix subscribers in April 2021. And this gave us a natural date to launch our app, which we called Shtisel Diary. Now, our diary app used basically the same infrastructure as the app developed for Michigan Diaries. And here we owe a really enormous debt to Russ Werner, who Betsy has mentioned already. And Russ was able to really quickly make this app for us because he was able to utilize the same infrastructure as the Michigan Diaries app. We also drew some insights from what Betsy and Suzanne had learned from launching the app over the past few months, and we made a few small alterations. So we gave it a backdrop that would be familiar to viewers of Shtisel. So that's Jerusalem stone that you see in the backdrop of the app on the screenshot there. And we included the word Shtisel written in Hebrew characters. That's right there at the top of the screenshot. We also included a set prompt on the home screen, so participants didn't have to toggle between questions sent to them by email and the app interface. Now, our app worked very much in the same way as the Michigan Diaries app. We asked participants to create audio diaries after watching episodes of the show and tell us what they saw and what they noticed. Viewers used a drop-down menu to tell us which episode they had watched, and then they hit record. Now, we were hoping by using the diary app as a data collection tool to capture the living room conversations of viewers as they streamed each new episode. We wanted to get a glimpse of viewers' immediate responses to the characters, the stories, and the plot lines. What made them gasp? What made them point something out? What made them mad? Or what made them reach for their phone to Google something unfamiliar? We could, of course, have used a survey or done interviews, but by asking viewers to hit record on the app on their phone immediately as the credits rolled, we hoped to gather their more immediate and unfiltered responses. And gather them we did. So what did we learn? So the volume of data that we collected far surpassed anything that we could have imagined when we were engaging in our originally anticipated mode of field work of ethnographic interviews. In the first week that the new series came to Netflix, we collected over 300 diaries from viewers across the world. We currently have about 580 diaries from just over 200 participants. Now, let me be totally candid. As a two-person research team, there is no way that we could have interviewed this many people ourselves. There was no way that, based on our budget, we could have paid enough contract researchers to gather this volume of data either. Now, there was another enormous advantage to using the app from a data collection perspective. As Betsy had mentioned, she and Russ built automated speech transcription into the app, which meant that all of the audio diaries could be automatically transcribed. So all that we had to do was upload those text files into our coding software so that we could begin coding and analyzing them. Now, this eliminated a really laborious data management step. And to be frank again, it also saved us a lot of money. So what have we learned from these diaries so far? Well, in their diaries, participants talked about their love for the show and their affection for its principal characters. Now, we discovered that the role of affect was really critical in fostering learning for our participants. Because the characters resonated with viewers, viewers became invested in them and invested in their lives, and they wanted to know more about them. So as one diarist who self-identified as Catholic told us, quote, "I have been anticipating this season so much because I feel so connected to the characters. It was just so wonderful to see them all again and to see their neighborhood in Jerusalem." Participants also spoke about new things that they had learned. Now, this often came in the form of statements phrased with terms like, "I noticed that," or "I didn't know that," that implied new content acquisition. So one diarist told us, for example, quote, "I saw on the episode today that Orthodox Jews say a little prayer before they eat or drink anything. That was interesting." Now, other learning came more in the form of observations or suppositions or questions. So our diarists asked a lot of questions. They asked about why Orthodox Jews dressed in sort of characteristic black and white or modest attire, why they ate certain foods, and why husbands and wives typically sleep in separate beds. They asked about divisions between different kinds of Jews in Israel, and they wondered about language, as they noticed that some characters spoke primarily in Yiddish, others primarily in Hebrew, and other characters switched between the two. We also noticed participants trying out new vocabulary, and the app was a real advantage here because it encouraged participants to try sounding out new words and using them in a sentence appropriately and applying new concepts. Now, this, of course, is a form of learning in and of itself. So check out this snippet, hopefully the audio works here, from an audio diary that was submitted from a participant in Denmark, and she described herself as Christian. Now, in this clip, she's talking about what she notices about the interior of the characters' homes and how the layout of their kitchens is designed to accommodate Jewish dietary laws known as kashrut, or more colloquially, keeping kosher. So here's what she says.
I love the kitchen with the 2 sinks. It's a strict division so that you can kosher. Actually, I don't even think kosher takes up a huge part of the series. I don't know if I pronounce it right. Kosher. I love the kitchen with the 2 sinks.
Okay. Another advantage of using the app rather than conducting an interview, for example, was that people often entered into a stream of consciousness. So without a direct interlocutor like an interviewer, they typically rambled from one topic to the next. They asked rhetorical questions of themselves, and they compared the situations that they saw on screen to life experiences they may have had or communities with which they were more familiar. So check out this clip. It's from a participant in the US who identified herself as Hindu. And in this clip, she's noticing that the men in the series characteristically smoke and drink alcohol. Now, there's no prohibition on those things in Judaism. And this was really confusing to her because in other religious communities that she's more familiar with, she's more used to those things being prohibited or at least looked down upon. So let's listen to what she has to say.
One big thing that I noticed was there's a lot of drinking alcohol and smoking. I mean, not just in this episode, it's been, since the beginning, but it was this episode where we saw Kive getting drunk at the restaurant. And it just it was just so flagrant. And it got me thinking whether, these practices are allowed in the religion, in the Jewish religion. For example, in Islam, there's an actual prohibition on drinking and smoking. In Hinduism, for example, there's perhaps no formal prohibition, but the most practicing or devout of Hindus would never be drinking and smoking like that. So it's kind of weird to see. If they were just ordinary Jews, that's one thing, but the fact that there were ultra Orthodox Jews, it was strange, put it that way.
So in this clip, she's confronting the fact that a tradition that is in many ways more restrictive than other traditions that she might be familiar with, certainly more restrictive in other aspects of their life, community is actually more permissive on the particular issues of drinking and smoking than other religious communities that she knows. And for her, that's a paradox that, as she describes it, feels strange.
One big thing that I noticed.
Okay. Now, frequently in these streams of consciousness, diarists express their judgments of Orthodox Judaism. When we conducted interviews with members of the Facebook group, we very rarely heard interviewees express their judgments of the tradition with the vitriol that we heard on the app, quite frankly. Now, we attribute this again to the affordances of the app. Without a direct interlocutor, participants may have felt more free to express their unbridled judgments of a tradition that certainly has its more restrictive dimensions. So this is the final audio clip I have for you today. This is from a diarist who self-identified as a non-religious cultural Jew from the US. And this is what she has to say.
Well, misogyny has come home to roost in this little community. As many feelings in this episode. Once again, the producers are very good at making you feel sympathetic for the humanity of these characters. But you can also see how the community itself can only function at the lowest possible level because people can't get out of their own way. They can't create, they can't do anything new. They can't suggest things to each other. They're in tremendous webs of deception about which family is doing what and who's living best to the so-called rules of that society. And I know it was played for humor. I know it was supposed to be funny, but I'm so annoyed at how repressed everybody is that I didn't find it too funny.
So as I think we can really see in this clip, where we shouldn't be too overly idealistic about the kinds of learning that can occur when people encounter other cultures through artistic media like television. It doesn't always lead to some kind of rosy situation of multicultural tolerance and understanding. So for this diarist, Shtisel only seemed to confirm the prejudices that she, as a secular Jew, holds against the ultra-Orthodox. In fact, even more than that, it attached images to them. It attached names and personae, and it really gave her an object for her animus.
Well, is that...
Okay, so to sum up, what have we learned from adapting this app and engaging in this project? Well, we're still collecting data, and we anticipate coding and analyzing hundreds of diaries over the coming months. But what we've learned so far, however, is that as viewers watch Shtisel, there's no doubt that they're engaging in really rich and nuanced educational experiences. We see viewers engaged in personal processes of speculation and elaborating on the questions that are raised for them by each episode of the show. We also see them confirming judgments that they already had about the cultures represented on the screen, however. Now, we didn't anticipate deploying digital fieldwork tools and methodologies to research television as a vehicle for religious and cultural education. And we certainly had never anticipated creating an app for collecting audio diaries. However, the richness of the data that we've been able to collect from Shtisel Diaries has made us both much more confident into dipping our toes into the waters of digital humanities. And in turn, it's also made us really aware of the many ways that the tools that we use for research can be inherently disciplinary and can benefit from conversations across disciplines as well. So I'm going to stop there. And I think at this point, we can open up for questions. Michael?
All right. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Betsy. It's fascinating. Yes, at this point, I encourage people in the audience to post questions or comments to chat or the Q&A function in the webinar. You can use either one of those if you want. I want to get things rolling, if you don't mind, and this is sort of a question for both of you. I'm curious. I mean, you might have spoken to this, and I might have missed it, so apologies if that's true. But do you have a sense of how people approach the diary? I mean, so if I were doing it, knowing who I am, I'd probably prepare. Like, I wouldn't just sort of like turn the app on and just start talking. I'd probably prepare. I'm curious if are there like guidelines for how you should approach the recording, or do some people read? It sounds like some people just, like you said, Laura, they just sort of talk and then just go where they go. But I wonder to what extent that's relevant to the question of data collection for your projects as well.
I'm so glad that you asked this question. Betsy and I were actually just talking about this the other day. And we asked people to hit record right after they had seen an episode. So
Right.
That's typically what they did. And one of the indications that we picked up on that seemed to suggest to us that we were getting people somewhat kind of unfiltered, off-the-cuff responses was that we typically heard them doing other things while they recorded their diaries. So we heard people doing dishes and like setting up their living rooms and like having side conversations with other people in the room. And for us, this was a real advantage, right? If interview settings can sometimes feel a little formal, right, and a little stilted, and we know that there's always going to be bias, right? And people are going to kind of filter their responses through the ways in which they try and interpret and account for that, for the bias of what they assume that the interviewer wants to hear. Well, none of those things go away in the context of the audio diary, but by taking away the face and the voice of the interlocutor, and the fact that we heard all of these audio signals of people really doing this in the background, having this conversation in the background as they did something else, gave us really good indication that we were getting something quite unfiltered.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, we find the same thing. And for our data, it's in fact, like, we really don't want people to be reading, because what we care about is how people actually do talk.
Mhm.
So we say that up front, but we also tell participants every single week, feel free to answer any or none of these questions. Feel free to just talk about whatever you want. And we do get pretty wide variation. Like our kids and our teens, they're shorter, they answer the questions. Sometimes they tell us little stories. We have some participants who submit a recording almost every day. And it's kind of their like daily practice of like, here's what happened today. But we find very much the same thing that Laura's data is finding, which is that people seem to be just talking. Like we get diary entries while people are driving home from work or while people are folding the laundry, things like that. So yeah, I think it is very much like a stream of consciousness. This is getting at people's thoughts and not really self-monitored.
Thank you. That's really interesting. We have a few questions now, and I'm going to go ahead and read the first one from John. Question for either presenter. The potential for getting feedback from a large number of people in various places is impressive and attractive. How do you think this mode of data collection contrasts with in-person interviews in the sense of the shape of the data? Does the modality impact something like data reliability, or do quantitative analytical processes make such differences in data collection irrelevant? Put differently, could this digital mode of gathering responses from people effectively replace in-person interviews?
This is such a good question. From our end, in sociolinguistics, the traditional ethnographic work that we do in person is deeply important for understanding how people's social local communities work, and remote recordings can't replace that. So we've been thinking about these remote recordings as a sort of complementary type of data, where it's like we get a deep dive, longitudinal, we can see what people in this style sound like over time. But it would be maximally good data if we could then pair it with the sort of insights that you can get from actually being physically in person and seeing, like, you know, aside from talking to me, who's talking to each other over there? What are their patterns of interaction look like? What are the sort of broad community values that people are exhibiting?
Yeah, thanks for that question, John. Similarly, I think I don't think of this as a tool for replacing face-to-face interviews or even Zoom interviews. For us, in the context of this project, this was one tool in a broader multiple methods investigation involving surveys, interviews, digital field work, and this was a really added component. So in our interviews, for example, we tend to run semi-structured interviews, meaning, of course, that we have a bank of questions that we're interested in, but particularly as people get into answering those questions, as they get onto interesting themes or themes that we haven't thought about, we can respond on the cuff and say, well, tell me more about that. No, don't move on. I'm really interested in this topic. And of course, the limitation with an audio diary is that we can't do that. We can't stop people and say, hang on, no, stop telling me about the plot line that you didn't like. Go back to the character that you were just describing, because there you were saying something really interesting. So of course, that is a limitation, and why for us, this was one tool within a multiple methods fieldwork project.
Thank you both for your replies. From Yael, thank you to both of you for your fascinating research and explaining the added value of using this research methodology. Could you elaborate on the extent to which certain generations are more active in participating? What was the most surprising findings that you have found so far? And it is really interesting how these shows can both serve a constructive way to education about cultural difference and perhaps contribute to creating or strengthening certain prejudices on the other hand. Might you elaborate more on that? So there's a couple of different questions in that, but I'll leave it up to you.
Okay. Yes, like Betsy, I didn't talk in my presentation about our population, but like the Michigan Diaries project, our population did heavily skew towards women. And we also noticed that members of the Shtisel Let's Talk About It Facebook group skewed towards women as well, though not completely, but the majority of the population were women. But beyond that, it really was a population, both in the Facebook group and in the Diaries project, that spanned generations, continents. We had a lot of European participants, actually, particularly one of the things that we noticed that there's a population who is particularly interested in this show who are German speakers, either native German speakers, heritage German speakers, or folks who have learned the German language at some point in their lives. And they're interested in this show because, of course, Yiddish has a lot of lexical similarities with German. And so hearing a Yiddish show, and it's not very easy to find Yiddish shows on Netflix, there's not too many of them, is a really interesting experience for German speakers. In fact, we had one participant who told us that she thought it was really annoying when the characters switched to Hebrew because she had to look up from her knitting and look at the subtitles on the screen, whereas when they're speaking Yiddish, she could just follow along listening and look down at her knitting. So in terms of how these shows can both, how a show like Shtisel can serve both as a constructive means to education about cultural difference, whilst also strengthening certain prejudices on the other hand, I would say that one of the major findings that we've come to in this project is that the contextual situations that viewers come to shows like this with heavily influences what they take away from them. And those can be both very sort of positive we have a lot of viewers who had grown up hearing Yiddish in their homes or who had grown up with ultra-Orthodox family members. And they saw watching a show like this really as a point of nostalgia, right? It was like a reminder of generations long past and a language they no longer get to speak. Whereas folks who had negative experiences in their own lives with the ultra-Orthodox were much less likely to experience the same kind of warm and fuzzy dimensions of the show that others were, and were much more likely to feel like they were having their prejudices confirmed.
All right, Betsy, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
Sure. I wasn't sure if that question was for our project or not, but I can talk a little bit about the differences that we find generationally.
Yeah, I think that might be interesting.
One thing and these are sort of broad patterns. We haven't dived into like a full-on analysis yet. But one thing that's pretty interesting to me is there is a general tenor difference between adults when they talk about when things are difficult and kids. So it is true that like the pandemic has been very difficult. People are experiencing trauma, people are experiencing grief, and even like just like extreme boredom. But on the flip side of that, as kids are going back in person, one thing that's been interesting to me to see is that some of our teens like very strongly prefer online class to in-person class, whereas the adults, when the lockdowns eased up, we started to see this like big relief, like, oh, we can have our lives back, this is wonderful. And the kids started talking about, oh, now I have to worry about what I'm going to wear to school today. Now I have to worry about straightening my hair again. During the pandemic, I could just be myself, and that was nice. And so that was kind of interesting to me as an adult who was like on this other side of things, very much looking forward to pandemic easing and going back to in-person, et cetera, to kind of be reminded about, yeah, just like how these restrictions are impacting adults and kids differently. There's one sort of we haven't done any linguistic analysis yet, except to say that I think this is kind of interesting. So I study pronunciation changes, not really vocabulary changes, but we did find this really big vocabulary fact where at the very beginning, people didn't know what to call the pandemic. So we were getting diary entries where some people were saying the pandemic, some people were saying COVID-19. We got a lot of euphemisms. So we got a lot of the current situation or these trying times. And then, so new terms kind of exploded in the late spring. And then by the time we got to the fall, everybody settled on the pandemic. And then we saw a similar thing happening with like the term that people used to call the group of people that they were okay to see in person. So like whether you call that your bubble or your pod or your learning pod or your social bubble, and pod is the one that won out there. So I thought that was kind of an interesting effect.
Thank you. We have two other questions that have been put in the Q&A, and I'll read the first one, then the second one. I might take us a little past the top of the hour, but so apologies if we extend this a bit, just a couple minutes beyond that. From Amy, great presentations. Laura, I wonder if in the responses you've heard examples of people trying out new ritual and or daily practices based on watching this show.
Yeah, Amy, thank you for that great question. I'd actually expand it a bit to say that not only did we find evidence of people taking on new ritual and daily practices, but really kind of every facet of the very nuanced culture that we see represented in Shtisel. So one of the things that we saw very strongly in the Facebook group, as well as in our audio diary app, was interest in learning the languages of Yiddish and Hebrew. So on the Facebook group, people often taught each other. People would say, "Hey, what does this word mean? I saw it in the subtitles, or I heard it in the audio," and doing a lot of teaching and learning, a very informal teaching and learning, as well as people reporting that they signed up for Duolingo. Duolingo added Yiddish this past year, and so a lot of interest in that. And we also saw from a very broad population, people expressing interest in adapting or taking on or experimenting with aspects of Jewish culture and Orthodox Jewish culture, even if they may not themselves have been Jewish. So one incident really stands out for me, which was somebody posting in the Facebook group about the time that the new series launched in April 2021, that she was not Jewish, but inspired by Shtisel, she had looked up a recipe for challah, the traditional sweet bread that is baked for the Sabbath on Friday nights and Saturdays. And she had shared that she had had this great experiment making this challah, and she was so proud of it. And then her comment engendered just hundreds of responses. And those responses turned from people who said, this is so great. This was a person who didn't identify as Jewish. She was from, I think it was Denmark. And people thought this was a really great example of cross-cultural understanding and learning. However, she had posted this post during Passover. Now, one of the prohibitions on Passover is refraining from bread. Now, of course, as a non-Jewish person, no such prohibitions apply to this woman, right? There was no reason why she couldn't bake a challah, but it engendered this really, really, at times, quite fiery debate about whether this was an appropriate post to post about challah during Passover. So there's just the richness of the data could really fill a whole book into itself.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you, Laura. The last question for today is from David. Are there new or difficult challenges in getting approval for this new kind of online digital human subjects research?
So I can say for us, not really. And I think it is in part because we are very clear to diarists that they can talk about whatever they want. So for typical sociolinguistic fieldwork, the human subject protection is primarily about, like, what are you going to be talking about? Are you going to be asking anything that's going to feel threatening or cause people to relive traumatic experiences? And I think the flexibility that we give to diarists is really important there. But the thing that is a little tricky for us more recently is the interaction between like our human subjects approval wasn't complicated, but we are interested in getting connected to schools and teachers. And there's another layer of research approvals that has to go through a school board. But I don't know that it's qualitatively different from normal in-person research approval.
I'll just add one very quick thing is that in some ways, having an app enabled our subject agreements and signing up for the app, it sort of integrated it into a somewhat seamless process, right? So when we arrange an interview with somebody, we're arranging that by email, then we're sending them via email, like, a link to their consent form, and they've got to separately fill that in and sign it. And we've got to follow up with them to make sure they've signed it before we begin our interview. Well, one of the things that was able to be built into the app when we used it was that participants would had to go through that process as a part of signing up for the app. So it for us, it really eliminated a data management step because we didn't have to send out separate emails. We didn't have to follow up. It was entirely integrated. So in that case, it felt like it was a real time saver.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Betsy. And we really appreciate your participation in the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Excellent presentations and wonderful Q&A. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate your time and hope to see you again in a couple of weeks when we have our next UIC presentation. Take care, everybody, and have a great weekend.